This happened when I was a kid. The story below combines my memory with my parents' recollection to depict what happened back then. As my parents worked away from home during the day, I was often asleep by the time they returned from work, only catching glimpses of them in the morning during breakfast as they got ready for work. So, most of the time after school, I spent my afternoons with my grandparents. They would often ride their bike, a wild wolf, to take me to the fields to work. Whenever we went out, they would bring along white mantou, steamed buns, and a jug of water. Upon arrival, they would place everything under a large tree, an ancient one with lush branches that resembled a huge umbrella, shielding us from the scorching sun. While my grandparents worked, I would play on my own, usually by the creek nearby. One day, a little boy appeared, and I found a new playmate. Whenever I went with my grandparents to the fields, would rush to the creek to play with him. Strangely, he was never there when I arrived. It was always a surprise when he suddenly appeared beside me. To this day, I still don't know how he managed to do that. When my parents took me out on holidays, I shared with them how much fun I had in the fields, making a new friend and playing in the creek. At first, they had no clue and didn't think much of it, assuming I was just enjoying myself. But as time went on, I started actively asking when we were going to the fields and even urged my grandparents to hurry up and go. I kept telling them I wanted to go to the creek to play with that boy. This puzzled my parents, and they began to wonder who this boy I was playing with was. They asked my grandparents, but they were just as clueless. They had only ever seen me playing alone by the creek. They didn't see any other child. As time went on, they noticed my behavior becoming strange. I seemed disconnected from reality and only interested in playing by the creek with the boy. I became somewhat aloof, and even my teachers noticed that I was acting differently during that time. They said I wasn't as friendly with other students as before. This worried my parents, and they began to think something might be wrong with me. They suspected that the boy I kept mentioning might not be a normal child. They started to think I might have encountered a paranormal playmate. To address their concerns, my parents took me to their workplace, avoiding going to the fields and instead taking me to temples on holidays. They even bought ice cream to distract me and shift my focus away from the creek. But I kept asking them when we were going to the fields, believing that only by going to the creek could I be satisfied. Unable to go to the creek, I often threw tantrums, making those times very difficult for my parents. There were a few occasions when they couldn't stand my crying and took me to the creek anyway. But when we got there, the boy was nowhere to be found. Each time was a disappointment, as I waited for a while but never saw him. So, we would head back home. During the last trip to the creek, my parents saw the boy standing by the creek from a distance. Excitedly, I pointed in his direction and exclaimed, "There's the boy. He's here." My dad decided to get closer to take a look. As we approached, just a short distance away from the creek, I suddenly turned to them and said something that sent chills down their spines. I said, "That boy is standing on the water. How amazing." When my parents looked in the direction I was pointing, they saw nothing. This made them nervous, and my dad's demeanor changed from gentle to one of concern. He asked me to show him where the boy was. I pointed to a spot on the water's surface and said, "He ran into the water." Thinking back now, he was facing us and drifting backward, moving toward the center of the stream. His body seemed to sink lower and lower, as if the center of the creek was very deep. Eventually, only his head remained above the water. At that moment, my dad's eyes were no longer gentle but filled with a sense of dread. It was the kind of look a child would give when faced with something terrifying. When I saw what I did, I instinctively pulled my hand back and grabbed onto my dad's shirt, crying out, "Daddy! Daddy!" My mom, in a loud voice, urged us to leave, scolding my dad for letting me get scared. Once we got back into the car, I started crying uncontrollably, all the way home. However, when we arrived home, I seemed to be in a daze, acting foolishly and absent-mindedly. After discussing it, my parents decided to take me to the temple to see the temple deity. The temple was located on a small hill in town, and inside was a thin temple deity. He listened as my dad recounted my experience and then went to offer incense and seek guidance. Afterward, the temple deity told my parents that there was indeed a spirit by the river, a boy who had tragically drowned nearby. After his passing, he stayed there. As I was the only one who could sense his presence, he didn't mean any harm. However, as I spent more time with him, my behavior and thoughts seemed to be influenced by him. Even though he didn't have malicious intent, my dependence on him grew, making me more and more isolated. Eventually, the temple deity performed a ritual on me to prevent me from seeing the boy again. Over time, my personality gradually returned to normal, and I re-established a close relationship with my parents. I also reintegrated into school life. One day, I told my parents that I dreamt of the boy again. Worried, my parents thought I might still be affected by the spirit. They even consulted the temple deity again. However, he assured them not to worry, saying that the boy had only come to bid me farewell. I detailed my dream to my parents, explaining how happy I was playing with the boy in my dream. But later, he went into a small house, turned back to wave goodbye to me, and then disappeared. Finally, my parents were relieved. The boy was no longer the ghost they had feared, but rather a friend who had accompanied me as I grew up. They thanked the temple deity and offered prayers and burnt offerings to the boy, expressing gratitude for his companionship and protection.